What's up, guys? This is TheKephas. Today I'm going to show you some macros that I've created with GNOME Sequencer Enhanced, an extremely powerful add-on that allows you to create robust macros that can perform most, if not all, of your rotation with a single button. This can be extremely useful if you have a disability like myself, or if you just want to be lazy. Bear in mind that these macros can be extremely helpful, but they also have their limits, so they're made primarily for those who are playing the game at a more casual level. But feel free to use them as you see fit. If you'd like to learn more about GNOME Sequencer and how to use it, I recommend that you head over to Wow Lazy Macros. You can find links to all of that, and to import strings for these macros in the description. Today we are going to check out the macro that I've created for Augmentation Evokers, the newest new kid on the block. This is the newest spec that's been added to the game for the Evoker class, and I've spent a few hours messing around with this class and working on a macro that honestly was surprisingly easy to make, and it functions pretty well. The challenge is really the nature of the class and how unique it is. Honestly, it plays a little similar to the Devastation Evoker, just with a few extra steps and a few other things to consider, because this isn't your typical, DPS spec. This is more of it's a DPS spec that kind of plays like a bard, really. It has this, it's an augmentation class. It's designed to buff your allies while you're dealing damage yourself. So it's sort of like that classic Ret Paladin kind of thing, where you're bringing a lot of extra enhancement to your allies. It's not entirely a healing class, but it's not a pure DPS class either. And honestly, it's a pretty interesting class, and one that I would consider looking into further if my vision would allow me to play it. But with all that being said, there's a lot to consider with this in terms of how it's going to work, and I want to be upfront and honest with you guys. I've only really tested this as a solo player, and the class, of course, is really designed around group play. So it would require a little bit extra testing and probably a lot more understanding from those of you who maybe have played this class a little bit more. So with all that being said, though, keep in mind that the goal here is to try to make the class as easy to play as possible and as accessible as possible with a macro. And, you would maybe argue that if you're going to, min-max this, if you're going to try to get the most out of it, you would not want to use a macro. So with all that being said, test this out, as we get into it, and we'll look at it, see how it works for you. Maybe try it, in open world or in easy content, see how it works and how it feels, and, just kind of consider, all that kind of stuff. So with that being said, before we actually take a look at the macro, let's go ahead and open up our talent tree here and take a look at our build. Now, honestly, when it comes to the Evoker side of the tree, it's mostly utility. There isn't a whole lot in the Evoker side that really matters. The exception, of course, being there's, much like with my Devastation Evoker, I've done very similar things here. There are a few popular utility spells that I didn't take, again, because I mostly do solo content. But there is, of course, tip the scales, and also, renewing Blaze, some nice, helpful abilities there that can be easily thrown into a macro with, with their cooldowns being relatively short. One of the ones that I did take, and this kind of changes up how Fire Breath is to be used, is, Leaping Flames, and this basically turns your Living Flame spell into an AoE, which is nice. It's great for, just making AoE easier, but it does require you to sort of empower your Living Flame a little bit. We'll talk about that in the actual macro, but it's something that does add a little bit of difficulty to the macro itself. Without this ability, you can just use Fire Breath as you would with a Devastation Evoker at Empower level 1, which is a lot easier in the macro. But with this ability, it adds a little bit more to consider in terms of, you want to power that up as much as possible. So we'll talk about that as we get there and we look at the macro. But with that being said, that's pretty much everything on this side. Now let's go ahead and look over on this side. And kind of, again, there really isn't a lot to go over, right? This is more or less a standard build. I'm just kind of following along with what I've watched, what I've learned looking up like icy veins, to be honest. I mean, like really, like there's a lot of inexperience on my end with a class like this and a playstyle like this, so I'm relying a lot on other people's, you know, experience and understanding of the class to make a build. And really, there's nothing in here that was hard to choose. I mean, it was all pretty straightforward stuff. I didn't do a whole lot of changing things up in terms of what seemed to be a standard build. I guess this is kind of a standard single target build. You know, but there are a few additions in this, you know, that I've taken that are pretty standard, and pretty much all of them, you know, are included in the macro. So, you know, obviously you have a lot of your augmentation abilities that aren't necessarily damage dealing abilities, and I've tried to fit as many of them as I possibly can into the macro, with the exception of a couple of, you know, like a couple of defensive ones that you really wouldn't want to use all the time. So yeah, obviously we have taken Upheaval, and you know, much like with the Devastation Evoker, we can make abilities like Upheaval and Fire Breath work in the macro. That's kind of exciting because in the past I was having a hard time with these types of abilities and getting them to work in the macro. So with all that being said, it's pretty straightforward in terms of my build. Not a whole lot to really go over in this at all. But you know, you've got, again, just your standard single target build here. Yeah, and so you'll be good to go there. So with all that being said, finally, let's go ahead and take a look at the macro. We're going to type /GSE to open up Gnome Sequencer, and this macro will be called KephAug. This is an all-in-one macro for augmentation evokers. So we're going to right-click that here, and if you want to use my talent build, then you can just kind of copy this here and paste it into your talent tree, and you'll be good to go. With all that being said, again, I've been liking to say that phrase a lot today. Whatever. Either way, let's move on and take a look at the actual macro itself. Right, so here's the macro, and if you've played with my Devastation Evoker macro, then this one will seem very similar. It's basically the same thing, just with a few change in abilities and a few different steps, and honestly, it's a little bit easier for some reason. I think it's just because there's not really a lot of AoE change up in terms of, you know, the character and, you know, the class. So starting from the top, we have Eruption. This is your essence spender, and we're going to have this in here a few times because this is a sequence macro. There are a number of abilities, and it just seems like a sequence macro works better than a priority macro, as it does seems to do with a lot of classes really in Dragonflight. So we have Eruption here, and then we have your augmentation abilities. So we have Prescience, is that how you say that? Prescience, and then we have Eben Might. Okay, after that we have another Eruption. The challenge that I was having mostly with this build was actually using our essence charges, and that is just because I was seemingly casting Living Flame way too much. And so what I did was I just added a couple extra eruptions throughout the sequence, and that just makes it so that you use it more. Then we get into our empowerment abilities, and I've learned mostly through WoW Lazy macros, and what people have figured out there is that to get your empowerment abilities to work, this is how you have to do it. You have no channeling commands, and specifically for your empowerment abilities, you have a no channeling command for the other ability. And that way it just keeps it from ever getting interrupted. So what happens is once you start casting Fire Breath through the macro won't try to cast anything else until it gets back to Fire Breath again. Now, what this will usually mean is that it will almost always, depending on how fast you're spamming the macro, cast Fire Breath as quickly as possible, whether it's at an Empowerment 1, sometimes maybe Empowerment 2, depending on how fast you're spamming. And, you know, that's basically how it's going to work. And the same will apply to Upheaval. So it will mostly cast these. Every now and then it gets hung up. Every now and then it'll interrupt itself and try to cast something else. I don't know why, because I've put no channeling in everything, and it's just sort of the nature of the macros. Again, I think it may have something to do with how fast you spam. The challenge, of course, with Fire Breath and with Upheaval is, so with Fire Breath, if you're trying to extend the AoE of your Living Flame, then you want to empower this higher, and you want to max it out even. So if you see yourself starting to cast Fire Breath, what you could consider doing is stop spamming the macro for a couple seconds, let that empowerment tick up, and then spam the macro again, and then use your second Fire Breath and that will actually use the ability. Same for upheaval, actually. If you are trying to get more AoE out of it, increase the range of upheaval, empowering it even higher, do the same thing. Watch for the animation, stop spamming, and then start spamming again to finish out the ability at a higher empowerment. That's one way to do it. The other option is to either take it at empowerment level 1, or as empowerment level as soon as it gets to it again, or just remove these abilities from the macro entirely and manage them separately yourself. That's the other option. But for simplicity, I'm keeping them in the macro just because that's the whole goal here, is to make it as easy to play as possible. Okay, so next up, we have our final eruption. I've had to put eruption in here 3 times. I tried it with just two instances of eruption, and I was still casting living flame a lot. And so I was sitting at max charges, max eruption multiple times while casting living flame. So adding in a third one, for some reason, that did the trick, and now I seem to be using up my essences pretty much like a lot, mostly, and occasionally casting living flame. And then when I have no essences, I'm casting living flame more often. Of course, we finally do get to living flame. So last up, we get down to our key press and key release, and you got your standard targeting stuff, and then you have, if you hold down shift, you can use Azure Strike. And really, Azure Strike is only used these days, well, for this class at least, when you are moving. Otherwise, you can just use living flame for AoE, empowered, with your talents and with fire breath, flame, whatever. Yeah, you know what I'm saying. So you don't really have to use Azure Strike as much with this class with augmentation, but you can hold down shift if you need to use it while you're moving, or you can just use Azure Strike on a separate button if you want to, if that's easier. It's entirely up to you, but it's included here just to make it an all-in-one macro. Under key release, just like with Devastation Evokers, I've done the same thing here. I put a couple of kind of utility abilities in here. We have tip the scales, which is going to basically make it so that your next empowerment ability you use will use at max empowerment, which is cool, especially for living flame, but it also might use it for upheaval. So you don't have a lot of control. It's just going to use it on the next one that's used. So if you don't like that, you can always remove it from the macro. Again, we're going for simplicity. And then we have renewing blaze in here. This is just for survivability. I added in because again, I do a lot of solo play. I'm taking on a lot of damage as a solo player, and this has a relatively short cooldown. So this just kind of helps me with extra healing, keeping myself alive, and preventing some downtime. So it's just kind of included there for that reason. So just again, if you don't like that, if you want to manage it separately, use it with more of your intuition, then you can remove it from the macro. If you remove both of these and you just kind of delete key release, make sure that you remove the key release section in the macro as well, for all of the blocks. Otherwise it might hang up the macro. With all that being said, that kind of goes over the macro. So to recap, what's going to happen here is your macro is going to try to use your augmentation abilities on cooldown. It's going to use your essences on eruption. It's going to use your empowerment abilities as quickly as possible, unless you try to watch the animations and manage your spamming. You just kind of see how it feels. And then of course for filler, it's going to use living flame. Now, one thing to consider, one kind of setback with a macro like this is, as you're using it, it's going to cycle through and then keep cycling through in order. It doesn't really matter what order it's in, because you're just going to be spamming through the macro anyways. But there is some intuition that is necessary and is very helpful when you're playing a class like this. So whenever you use even might, I believe is what it's called. It's one of the empowerment abilities. Yeah, Even Might. So when you're using Even Might, you use this ability, and then pretty much all of your other abilities, except for Living Flame, increases the duration of Even Might. So ideally, when you use Even Might, you want to have max charges of Essence if you can. So that way, every time you use Eruption, you're extending the duration of Even Might, which is buffing your teammates, right? That's kind of the idea. And that also applies to your abilities, your empowerment abilities. They also increase the duration. So obviously, this macro isn't going to guarantee that you're always going to have this stuff ready for when that happens, because the macro is just going to spam through the abilities. So that is a setback, and there really isn't a way to prevent that at all. I mean, I can't really think of a way to make it guarantee that you'll be set up where you need to be every time you use Even Might. The macro is going to use Even Might on cooldown. It's going to use abilities as it gets to them as much as possible. So keep that in mind. I mean, that's just kind of the nature of using a macro. A class like this may not be, I mean, no class really is, honestly, but like a class like this with you know, extra steps, extra things to think about, it's never going to be ideal to macro, you know, but we're not going for min-maxing. We're going for simplicity, and that's what this is going to do. Fortunately, you know, Even Might does have a relatively short cooldown, but you can extend that duration for much longer. And I mean, I don't think you can keep it up, you know, 100% of the time, but the longer you can keep that up, the longer it's available. Obviously, it's good for your team. So that is the biggest thing. You know, everything else though is pretty straightforward. You know, again, except for, you know, Fire Breath, and, you know, using that on 1 empowerment versus using that on maximum empowerment. But with all that being said, though, it does work pretty well. I mean, it's pretty, you know, standard. It seems to run pretty smoothly, and certainly out in the world, it's pretty fun to play with. So if you're running around, honestly, I kind of like playing this more than Devastation. It just kind of feels a little bit better to me. I like the rotation. It's a little bit simpler, and it does pretty well out in the world as a solo player. So you can give it a shot if you want to. Let me know what you think about it. I've had a lot of requests for this one, but again, it's just a little challenging with how the class plays. So, you know, let me know what you think about it in the comments below, and I will see you guys on the next one. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button. And feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. And if you'd like to see more videos, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook, and if you'd like, you can support my work on Patreon. Links to all that stuff can be found in the description below. This is TheKephas. Until next time.